Oh, yeah.
Terry, am I unmuted now?
We can hear you, Michael.
Great, thank you. Hi, Julie. Hi, Jim.
Hi,
Hi, Michael.
Good. All righty. Terry's going to mute everybody now, and we'll get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Michael Spath, and I'm the Executive Director of the Indiana Center for Middle East Peace, based in Fort Wayne, Indiana. We're the Indiana voice for peace, justice, human rights, and intercultural encounter. To prevent Zoom bombing, we're keeping your screens muted. If you'd like to submit a question to our guest, and we encourage you to do that, please do so via the chat function at the bottom of your screen, and I'll be monitoring it for questions throughout the interview. We're really delighted today to welcome our friend, Pastor Carrie Ballenger, pastor of the English-speaking congregation of the Lutheran Church of the Redeemer in the Old City of Jerusalem. We're going to be recording this interview, and it'll be available on our Indiana Center for Middle East Peace YouTube channel later on this evening, and I'll be sending it out to those who are on our activist email listserv. So Carrie, welcome. It's good to see you. It's good to catch up with you. Even with all the unrest in our country, Carrie, we've been thinking very much of you and our friends in Palestine and Israel. I know you have many friends here on the interview today. So tell us, how are you doing in these strange COVID days? And have you been able to stay safe and healthy these last weeks?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. It's great to see all your faces and to connect with you this way. I'm doing fine. And that, first of all, thanks for asking about that. I've been healthy. I've been able to stay safe in my home. I was quarantined for the first couple of weeks because I did come in contact with a visiting pastor here. It was one of the last tour groups here before everything shut down, and that pastor had the virus. And so I did spend 2 weeks in total quarantine, but I've been really healthy, and except for the fact that my pants don't fit anymore because I baked bread for 2 months straight. Other than that, I'm doing fine.
I wasn't aware that you had been in contact with one of the COVID carriers in the Holy Land.
Yeah, unfortunately, this was a pastor from Minnesota, and he was here, visited me with a large church group, and the next day they flew home, and he tested positive. And so then they informed me, and unfortunately that pastor passed away of the virus a couple of weeks later. So, I think there's hardly any one of us that hasn't been connected or touched in some way by this sickness. And unfortunately, that was a sad ending to that story.
Oh my.
Yeah.
That must have been in the very early days. I mean, if they were able to return, because the Bethlehem tourist groups were quarantined there, right?
Right. So the West Bank was on lockdown as of March the 4th. We had service on March 8th. And then I met with this group on March 12th. And it was just right after that we found out that pastor was positive. And it just, here things just went really quickly after that. And the country shut down.
Sure.
Quickly, yeah.
I wanted to say thanks to you, Carrie, for coming in. It's 9 o'clock at your time, and you're looking pretty chipper for being 9 o'clock at night. I just want to tell you.
Thank you. We'll see how it goes in an hour. What I'm looking.
Good. Well, we'll honor our time restraints. Hey, before I ask you about your role in assisting the Lutheran bishop there, I want to ask you about your parish work. You're an ordained minister in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, assigned to do ministry in one of the most troubled parts on the planet, in a context of 3 global faiths, the place where Christianity began, awash with Jesus sites, a congregation of indigenous Palestinian Christians, but also others from around the world working in the region for periods of a few years. In normal times, welcoming guests from the global Christian community, activists, scholars, archaeologists, and other Christians who worship with you on Sunday mornings. Oftentimes, more than half of the congregation are your guests in normal times. This is a crazy, eclectic group of people to whom you're ministering, and in a crazy, eclectic, and wonderful and challenging place. I want to just give you an opportunity to talk to us about what ministry is like in a place like that and with people like this.
Well, the way you describe it, I think, wow, I can't believe I do all of that. But
you're pretty amazing.
Wow. It is a really interesting ministry. And, you know, I went to seminary and thought that I wanted to do urban ministry, and I did my internship and field education in urban Chicago. And then I was called to a rural congregation in a town of 900 people as my first call. And then I was senior pastor of a large, wealthy Chicago suburban church. And then I came here, and, you know, talk about totally different contexts. All of those are very different. But I think at the end of the day, as weird as this congregation is, and I'll talk more about that, people are people. And all the skills that I used in rural ministry and urban ministry and suburban ministry are really fundamentally the same, in that it's about connecting with people, hearing their stories, walking with people in wherever they're at, and hearing their stories and getting to know about their lives. So that's what I do here, just as I did in small town Capron, Illinois. Now, there are some things that are really unique and interesting about this congregation. As you said, we have sometimes as many as half of the congregation as visitors. And those are people who are just coming, like some of you who have been to Redeemer as pilgrims and tourists. But the ones that are there, the other half, they are also very transient. So a lot of our congregation are people that are just there for 3 months at a time. They're here to volunteer, to study, for sabbatical, something like that. So I have to really connect with people quickly. And so I often say when people come to church that the way you become a member is you come twice. And that really is how we do it. We don't have membership classes. We don't even have membership roles. Just if you come twice, you're now an official member. And then I always joke that if you come 3 times, you're probably going to be on the church council. And it's not much of a joke, actually, because we really have to just incorporate people right into the life of the community and into leadership almost immediately. I really love that because I remember being senior pastor of Bethany Lutheran in Crystal Lake, Illinois, and we had a whole hospitality team, people who were in charge of following up with visitors and taking a loaf of bread to their home, or sending a postcard, or making sure they got a coffee mug with our website on it, right? We all do these things to try to get people to come back. But here I know that most of the people that walk through the door are never going to come back. And so we have the freedom to just practice hospitality for the sake of hospitality, just welcoming everyone and having them be a part of the community. We don't have members and non-members. We just really have Redeemer. Whoever comes through the door that day is Redeemer Church. And I find that really freeing and wonderful.
I wanted to ask you about the other part of your job, give you a chance to talk about your work with the bishop, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Jordan and the Holy Land. It's probably one of the denominations that has one of the most. It's a small denomination with a big name, with a large name. But because of its history and geography, its witness is really great. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about the ELCJHL but all in the as itself. Then in the context of the larger Lutheran world church, the global Lutheran church, and then also as part of the larger Palestinian Christian community. So could you say a word about your work with the bishop, but in the context of the larger church?
Right. So I'm sent here as a missionary through the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, but I'm sent to accompany the ELCJHL, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Jordan and the Holy Land. And so half of my job is pastoring this English-speaking international congregation, and the other half of my job is assisting Bishop Ibrahim Azar, who is a Palestinian Christian and the bishop of the ELCJHL. And in that role, I'm helping him to write sermons and speeches and official statements, anything that he really needs to do in English. My job is to help to communicate his ideas and messages out to the English-speaking world. The ELCJHL is a small church. It is only about 2,500 members spread across 7 congregations. So we are very small. And if you think about that, we are in direct relationship with the ELCA, and the ELCA has how many congregations? I think 9,300 congregations, something like that. And we have 7. However, we make a really big impact on Palestinian society here, and that's mostly through our schools. We have 4 Lutheran schools, which are in Beit Jala, Bethlehem, and Beit Sahur, and Ramallah. Our schools have more than 3,000 students. So we have more students than we have members of our congregations.
What's the percentage of Muslim and Christian in those schools?
Well, it depends on the town. So in Beit Sahur, which is still a predominantly Christian town, about 70% of the students are Christian and 30% are Muslim. But in Ramallah, I would say more than 90% of the students in the Lutheran school are Muslim students. And that reflects the makeup of the town, actually. So, and I think Bethlehem now is about 50-50. But these are Lutheran schools, and the kids have Christian education. However, the Muslim students have a Muslim teacher who comes in for their religious ed classes as well. And then once a month, the Christian and Muslim students have a religious ed class together where they learn about each other's religion, which I think.
Carrie, I want you to continue talking about the ELCJHL in regard to the larger church, but as long as you're talking about schools, what I know about Christian schools in Israel and Palestine is that because I don't know if it's because of socioeconomic levels or whatever it might be, but really they train future leaders, political leaders, the medical professionals and legal professionals, religious leaders. I mean, a lot of the leaders in Palestinian civil society come out of the Christian schools. Has been the history, hasn't it been?
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I mean, we have very good schools, and for sure, Muslim parents are eager to send their kids to Christian schools. I mean, there are a couple things that are good. We have wonderful curriculum. We have wonderful teachers. We also have co-educational schools, so boys and girls are learning side by side. And I think that there's a recognition that that's good and different from many places in the Middle East and even here in the Holy Land. I think there was a study done a few years ago in Palestine that showed 1 in 5 people in Palestinian society have somehow been affected by or gone through our Lutheran schools.
Wow.
1 in 5 people. So really, that's a huge impact that we have, even though we're a small church.
You want to say something about the Lutheran Church in the region in connection with the other Christian denominations there, the larger Christian community in the Holy Land?
Well, so Christians are only about 1.5% of the population in all of Israel and Palestine, 1.5%. So Christians as a whole are an extreme minority. And then Protestant Christians are a tiny minority of that minority. You know, most of the Christians in this place are Roman Catholic or Greek Orthodox or some other variety of Eastern religion. So we have Syrian Orthodox, Greek Catholics, Armenians, just about every Ethiopian Christians, Ethiopian Orthodox. So we have many, many different Christian church bodies. And so we're a small denomination, and we are relating to all of these other bodies ecumenically. But we have some differences, and one of the main differences is me.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you. I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, so none of the other churches here ordain women at this time. The Anglican Church does not ordain women in this diocese.
That's right.
And that is unusual in the Anglican Church worldwide. But the Jerusalem diocese is allowed to have that difference. And I could talk more about that later. Until this last year, the Lutheran Church also had not ordained women here. But in September, Bishop Azar ordained Maria Lepakari, who's from Finland. And she's been working here for 5 years as the director of the Swedish Theological Institute, and had been prepared for ordination for years and just had never done it. And Bishop Azar stepped up and said, we want to ordain you. And that was really wonderful. Of course, she's not local. You know, this is an international Finnish woman. However, Bishop Azar's daughter, Sally Azar, is in seminary right now. And she will, inshallah, be ordained in about 1.5 years as the first Palestinian woman ordained to ministry here. So that's very, very exciting.
Although there aren't, let me just follow up with that. Although there aren't other denominations that ordain women in the region, do you have any other professional clergy colleagues from other denominations with whom you could have a joint Bible study, or you know, in terms of sermon preparation, or other colleagues, pastoral colleagues who you relate with?
Yes, Tuesday mornings, we have a morning prayer service that I run at Redeemer, and then we follow that up with a Bible study. And initially I had intended that to be for the congregation, but it turned into a pastoral text study. And that brings in really the international pastors who are here. So we have a pastor at the Scottish Church who comes. We had a UCC pastor and a Methodist colleague, Presbyterians. Most of them have gone now, either because of budget cuts or because of COVID, unfortunately. But we still get together. Right now, that Tuesday morning text study and prayer is me and my Presbyterian colleague from the US, and Victor Macari's wife, Sarah. I don't know if you know Victor. So it's sometimes the three of us, but we figure where 2 or 3 are gathered, we're we heard that God is present. I read that somewhere.
Was the UCC colleague Lauren McGrail by any chance? When
Yes.
She was, yeah.
Yes.
But I didn't hear you say anything about any of the indigenous church clergy part of that.
Let me tell you about, I didn't talk much about the congregation. So there are 7 congregations in the ELCJHL, and mine, which is English speaking, and then the other 6 are Arabic speaking congregations. And we have all male pastors right now, soon to change. No, that most of they don't really come to my text study because they're Arabic speaking and because they have their hands full, and most of them are on the other side of the wall. So they're in West Bank, and it's quite an ordeal to get from there to Jerusalem just for a Tuesday morning text study.
Many of us here have worshiped with you, Carrie, on a Sunday mornings, and those of us who've been privileged enough to prepare sermons here, those of us who are clergy here, know a little bit about the process of crafting sermons. Talk a little bit about your process of crafting a sermon that takes into account the international nature of your congregation, that doesn't flinch from Israeli injustices, that's sensitive to the concerns of your Palestinian families, but that's most important. But the most important thing, that it's gospel, that it's the gospel of Jesus. Just talk a little bit about that, because you do it, and you do it well.
Well, thank you. That's nice to say. I think that, well, I don't know how different it is from anyone else's process, but I can tell you my process. I mean, I begin really in scripture, and I always think of a book about preaching that I read in seminary, and I can't remember now who it was, which book it was, but the author said, it's always important to read scripture and not ask the Bible, how can I preach you, but to let the Bible preach to you first. And I think that's a good place to start, because I think when you're preaching every week, sometimes you can read the text and just be instantly thinking, oh, how am I going to make this interesting? Or what do I have to say? And first, if you start with what is scripture saying to me, if I start there, then that's usually a much better sermon. And then I make sure that I have the text with me. I print it out and I carry it with me, and I'm thinking about it all week long as I'm going through the old city of Jerusalem, as I'm ministering to people, as I'm talking to shopkeepers, paying attention to the news. And that's how I'm able to sort of make sure that scripture is a living word in this context today. But it requires paying attention and really having that in my mind all the time. I think it's important to name where we see evil in the world, and where we see sin, and where we see injustice. Otherwise, it's really hard for me to understand how it's good news if we don't know really what do we need good news, what do we need to be hearing liberation from, what is going on in our lives that we need the good news for. And so I do name the realities here. I talk about occupation, I talk about the wall, I talk about racism and violence. I think it's important that we name those things. I did, when I came here the first year, 2014, was just when the Gaza war was going on. And I stood up and I preached, and I said the word occupation. And we had an organist at the time, our pianist, who was very angry with me. And when she came out at the door after the service, she said, "You can't say that word in a sermon." And I said, "Well, I certainly can, because I just did." And she said, "Well, you can't do that." And the sermon had been about bearing the cross. And I said, "Well, I think it's important that we notice where people in the world are carrying the cross, and who among us is carrying the cross today." And she said to me, the musician said to me, "Your sermons are the cross I have to bear." Which I thought was pretty funny. She wasn't the pianist very much longer at the church after that.
Is there a language you can't use? Have you found, for example, or does it have to be very contextual? I guess I'm asking you, can you be a proponent of BDS and still remain in the country? I mean, can you get what I'm asking? Are there things you can't say, can't propose, or do you have to couch it in a certain kind of language?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, first of all, on the issue of BDS, I wouldn't talk about that from the pulpit, because it is not a tactic or a strategy that the ELCJHL endorses. And I'm here at the invitation of the bishop of the ELCJHL, and I'm here to accompany their church. I'm really, at the end of the day, I'm a visitor in this place. And so I'm always careful not to step into things that are not my place in that way. So neither the ELCA nor the ELCJHL endorse BDS. That's important to say.
Yeah.
But I think the other thing is when you say how to be careful, I mean, one of the struggles I have, and this is a struggle for me right now, as a matter of fact, is I'm American. And so I see things through American eyes. And right now, of course, I'm very focused and paying attention to what's happening in the US. You know, this is heartbreaking for me to see what's going on. At the same time, kind of exciting, because I think what's happening is this a big moment? But when I stand up and I preach here in Jerusalem, that is not the primary concern in this place. You know, there are Americans in my congregation, but most of them are not American. And the present reality here is occupation, and right now the threat of annexation, which is set to happen in a few weeks. And so sometimes that's a challenge where I have to remind myself that I can't stand up and preach from my perspective all the time. I have to try to understand. Last week I talked about George Floyd, but I was connecting it to what was happening here as well. It has to, somehow we have to be able to preach to everyone in the pews.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about Palestinian liberation theology and Black Lives Matter. I want to hold that off for just a minute, though, because last week or maybe you want to fold it in, because last week in your sermon you talked about, I call it the evil eye or the all-seeing eye, but you talked about your experience with that, seeing that, was it in a monastery in Egypt, was it, or somewhere? And but then it was reinterpreted for you as your God's eye view of the world, and that opened up a whole new possibility. And then you wove in your sermon the George Floyd incident as well as the Palestinian struggle. You want to say a word about that? But in the context of maybe Palestinian liberation theology, if that does that inform your theology at all in your preaching?
Sure. I mean, I've been really fortunate to sit with Christian leaders here and to hear how Palestinians interpret scripture. And I'm part of that is being involved with Sabeel Liberation Theology Center here. And I've had the chance to sit with Naeem Atik and to actually to help write some articles for them for their magazine. And, you know, I think I was really fortunate that I graduated from Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago, and learned a lot about liberation theology anyway at that institution. And so it was kind of natural to fold Palestinian liberation theology into that. You know, I'm trying to think of a specific instance. I guess what I would say is when for example, when I was assisting Bishop Munib Yunan, who's the retired bishop of the ELCJHL, I assisted him for the first 3.5 years I was here. He often would talk about the struggles that Palestinians have with the Old Testament. And that was new to me to think about that. And he said, you know, it's difficult because of course we proclaim that God's word is there in all of scripture, in the Old Testament and the New Testament, but that as a Palestinian, it's a great challenge to find good news in the Hebrew scriptures, which are often used today in the modern world to oppress Palestinians. So that's something that I've been learning more and more about, the struggles, and then how the Lutheran Church and the pastors here have been working against that and trying to work with their congregations to have a different relationship with the Hebrew scriptures, undoing some of the things that have happened for them spiritually since 1948. So that's a piece of learning for me. Yeah, I'm in a process with that. You know, I think every time I sit down and have the chance to hear a Palestinian Christian interpret scripture, it changes my theology and enriches it.
Opens up new worlds of meaning.
Yeah, I mean, when I first started helping Bishop Munib to work on sermons. And I was brand new here and very excited to help him. And he would say, well, so here's the text we have. And then he would say, what do you think we should say, Carrie? And I would say, well, I think we could talk about this and this and this. And he would say, no, just like, no. And then he would say, let me tell you how I see this as a Palestinian. And I just think that's such an opportunity, to hear someone and a person who's occupied, a person who's coming from a position of occupation and oppression. And how does that change how you read scripture? It certainly changes it. It makes me think of all the things that I assume about scripture.
As long as we're talking about this intersectional connection, throughout Israel, there have been clashes with police protesting the killing of Iyad al-Halik, mistakenly shot by border police about a week and a half ago outside Lions Gate in the old city while walking to his special needs school. We are here, of course, so there's been all kinds of protests throughout Israel, Haifa, Jaffa, and other places in Israel and in Palestine. We hear, of course, and at those protests, we've seen signs connecting with Black Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matter movement here. We here it can't go unnoticed that as we've seen what happened to George Floyd and others, the Israeli military tactics learn from the Israeli military to our police forces, the chokeholds, the knees on the neck, etc. So these intersectional connections are being made within Israel, within the United States, and between the two movements. You want to say a word about Iyad al-Halik for us and the ongoing protests and how it's impacted your congregation and any other connections you want to make intersectionally?
Yeah, so unfortunately, this young man, Iyad was 32 years old and autistic and was walking, as you said, to his special school, sort of a daycare center for adults. And the police at Lions Gate told him to stop, and he didn't understand what they wanted him to do, and he got frightened. And so he turned and he ran, and they shot him 8 times, including while he was on the ground. He was on the ground face down, and they shot him, and he died. And it was interesting that happened around the time of George Floyd's murder. Exactly. And you're right, people are definitely noticing similarities. I think what's the very sad similarity of this is that both of these cases are so common, and that's, George Floyd's murder just happened to be caught on video, right? And we know that this sort of violence happens all the time, and then the names don't become known, and there are no protests. And the same was said here. This man was murdered, and he was not armed. He had special needs. There was no reason that he should have been shot the way that he was and killed in the streets. But Palestinians are killed every day in that way all the time, and it never makes the news. And I think that's the really horrible intersectionality there, is that this is not confined to one place. So we have seen protests here at Black Lives Matters protests. I think I have a hard time judging how sincere some of them are. I get frustrated because there are Israelis who are protesting and marching in Tel Aviv and other places. But I just wonder if this is if they're just upset because Iyad al-Halik had special needs, if you know what I mean. If that's why they're willing to stand up and say that this is wrong. Are Israelis really ready to change the system to say that Palestinian lives really matter? If that's the case, then we need to get rid of the wall, and we need to make sure that there really is a chance for justice and peace here. So I'm not trying to be too cynical, but it just makes me wonder if people are just eager to kind of be part of this movement that's going on, be part of this, the kind of excitement, or is this real? Is there going to be some change? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. Well, time will tell.
I'm going to read one of the questions that came from the chat room. Carrie, do you think there would be peace if Israel withdrew to the Green Line and no longer occupied Palestinian land? How do you address Palestinian Muslims who will never tolerate a Jewish state on, quote, our land, the land of Palestine?
Well, I don't know what the future is of the two-state solution. What I can tell you is that neither side is willing to have one state. That's a fact. Because, you know, Israelis do not want to give up the dream of a Jewish state, and therefore would not accept one state, would not accept incorporating all of the Palestinian cities and territories into to be part of Israel, at least not in a way in which everyone received equal rights and equal votes. And I in that question, I heard someone said, what about Muslims that would never accept? I mean, I think it's true on both sides. There are people who would never accept one state. Mostly what I hear from Palestinians is they say we would not accept any deal in which we don't have equality, in which we would not have a vote. So it is really a problem right now, especially because we're looking at annexation. If I can just talk about that for a moment. So
yeah, we know my next question, so I'm glad. Please.
You know, I think in a way it's just solidifying and normalizing what's already happening on the ground. So it's not going to change daily life very much at all to annex the settlements. However, it is just kind of the death knell of the two-state solution, it feels at this time. You know, every time Israel takes more territory, it makes the possibility of a contiguous Palestinian state that less likely. So it's not that it's a giant change in reality here, but it is sort of showing us this is reality. And I was going to say, I had a conversation about this the other day related to what's going on in the U.S. and with our current U.S. president. Some people will say that President Trump has caused all of this that's happening, right? And others say, you know, the United States was always heading towards some kind of uprising because we are a racist society and founded upon racist values and history. And it was always going to happen that someday people would rise up and say no more. And maybe Trump just got us there sooner. I'm not saying this is something that we were having a conversation about. And I think that in a way, that's what's happening here, is that we've always been on a path towards annexation. You know, we've had all this talk for decades about peace and two-state solution, and yet nothing has really gone forward in that direction. Settlements are getting bigger, more and more land is being taken, and maybe now is just that moment where it's becoming real. It's kind of depressing when you think about it that way. That doesn't mean I don't think that we're going to have that. It doesn't mean I don't have hope. In fact, I'm working on a sermon this week on hope. We'll see how that comes out. But I think we always have hope, and we have hope that in the end there will be justice and there will be peace, and then we'll have reconciliation. But it's hard to know how we get there from here. That's what I don't know. How do we get there? And so the person's question, do you think if we went to the Green Line, I don't know if that would make peace. It would certainly take us in a better direction if we could have agreed upon borders. But just like in the US, as that white people are going to have to give up some privilege, in this place, Israelis would need to give up some things. They would have to be willing to give up some things in order for there to be equality here and justice here. And that's a hard thing. It's a hard ask.
When you preach in Jerusalem, you say you write your sermon and you walk around the city and you first let the Bible speak to you without imposing any of yourself upon it. Then you walk around and you live your life and minister to people and let those concerns that impact the direction of the sermon. I know sometimes you furlough in the U.S., if you were here today, I mean, you kind of gave a hint about it just in your previous answer, but let's say that we welcomed you to Illinois or Indiana or Texas or back home in Oklahoma this Sunday. What would your sermon look like in this context, but knowing what you do about what's happened in Jerusalem?
Oh my goodness. That's kind of unfair, Michael. I don't know. I think, well, today I was working on my sermon. We have Romans 5 as one of our readings. And so I'm thinking about the relationship of suffering to hope. And I'm not sure what I would say I don't know what I'm going to say this week in this context, but what I'm trying to think about is what that relationship is, right? And is it, and how appropriate would it be for me as a white person to stand up and say to folks, well, suffering produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not disappoint. I mean, it's a tough word right now to people who are suffering, right? And so I don't know quite where that's coming from, but always I would say we can't give up on hope, but I don't know that hope is something that we achieve or that we can just decide to have. Somehow hope is something that we walk around in. It exists. It's like the water we're swimming in somehow. So I don't know exactly what I would say.
You know what impresses me about your answer, and maybe it's an entree, is that you bring a lot of humility to your discussion of hope, and maybe that's what people of privilege. I mean, you're a white woman, American Christian, in that context, and so how do you speak to indigenous Palestinians who are occupied? Likewise, most ministers here haven't walked in the shoes of a George Floyd. I certainly haven't. I haven't walked in a woman's shoes. I mean, I'm a white male of a certain socioeconomic class and of a certain age. My God, my privilege gets multiplied, multiple times. So and yet the gospel is a burden upon our hearts to share, and so we approach it very humbly, and that's what impresses me about your answer, Carrie, when you speak about hope.
Well, I think that one of the things I've thought about just today in this reflecting upon hope is a lot of groups come to Israel and Palestine, and they will ask me or ask our bishop or the pastors, where do you find hope?
Yeah.
And one time I was sitting with our retired bishop, Bishop Yunan, and he listened to that question and he got really quiet, and then he said, I'm really tired of that question. He said, because I feel that you as Americans come here and you want me to gift you with hope. He said, but your job is to come here and give me hope. He said, your job is to come here. I am the oppressed and occupied person here. And you have so much privilege and power and possibility to help us. How about you tell me where my hope is? And I just thought that was such a good answer. And I mean, you should have seen the faces around the room. People just sort of went, ooh. But I think that that's really true, that we shouldn't expect people who are currently suffering to somehow be fonts of wisdom and hope. And I think that might be true for us as white people in the situation today in the United States. You know, we don't want to try to move our Black and brown friends too quickly towards hope and some spiritualizing their suffering or expecting them to somehow all be Martin Luther King Jr.'s. You know, this is a terrible time and there's a lot of pain. And maybe our job is to give others hope, not to expect them to be super hopeful and joyful and at this moment. We move too quickly to reconciliation and to trying to tie everything in a neat little package, I think.
That was an important and strong word. We expect those upon whose neck our knee is resting, or at least we're complicit in the knees that are resting on their necks, to somehow make us feel better.
Right.
And so that was an important pastoral word to us. We have a question from the chat room, another question, and it impacts me too, because some of my dearest friends in Israel and Palestine are the Bethlehem Christians, George and Najwa Saada, whose daughter Christine was killed by Israeli military hit squad, and also Rami Elhanan, whose daughter and Narit Peled Elhanan, whose daughter Smadar was killed by a suicide bomber at a restaurant not far from the old city. Both of Rami is one of the leaders of the bereaved parents group, and George and Najwa are the most prominent Christian members of the bereaved parents group. We've hosted them here in Fort Wayne. Talk a little bit about do you know much about the bereaved parents organization? And one of the criticisms by some in the activist movement here in the US and around the world is that somehow they normalize in their dialogue with each other, they normalize the occupation, or they normalize the system of injustice. So talk to us a little bit about the bereaved parents group and how your feelings about them, and if you have relationships with any of them.
Well, first of all, have you read the book that's just been written about them, A Paragon?
Yes.
Yes, very good. Yes, I know of the group, and we've had them speak at our church before. I think that normalization is a real thing, and there are some organizations here that I would call normalizing organizations. I would not count Parent Circle or the Bereaved Parents Group to be that. I think that—
Me either, by the way, me either.
Yeah, I think it's different, because what I have experienced from them is that they're really just sharing their stories, and there are no apologies. When I've heard them share their stories, they tell them exactly how they happened and how hard it was and how awful the deaths of their children were. And it's not done apologetically. And I think it's really great. I think that anytime we tell our stories that way, it changes people. So but on the issue of normalization, I think there are groups that just bring people together for the photo ops, essentially, or they're not paying attention to the power dynamics, for example. So you might have a group that says, well, we're going to bring Israelis and Palestinian kids together to play basketball or whatever it is, but they come and they play basketball, but they never go any deeper than that. You know, there's never really any understanding. And at the end of the day, what I've noticed, well, I should back up to say, my kids went to high school here in Jerusalem. They went to the Anglican International School. And my older son, Caleb, made friends with a number of Palestinian kids at the school. And then he made friends with some Israeli Jewish kids outside of school through music, because he was really into like techno music, and he found some friends through music groups online. And I was really proud of him. I thought, oh, this is so cool that he is connecting with people in various parts of society here, you know, Palestinians and Israelis, and that was fine. It was all fine until he was a senior in high school. And his Israeli friends were preparing to do their military service, which is mandatory here. And he came home one day and said, Mom, I just realized that my Israeli friends, he didn't say it that way, but he said, my friends, you know, Shahar, and he said, they're going to be holding guns pointed at my Palestinian friends next year. And then he realized that he was not going to have to do any of those things. He was going to get to pick a college and go and do whatever he wanted, whereas his Palestinian friends didn't have the right of movement, and his Israeli friends had mandatory military service. And I think that's what I'm saying is about when you look at groups that we would call normalizing, they don't address these types of deeper issues, systemic issues. They just try to get people together and say, well, if we just eat hummus together and share a cup of coffee, it'll all be fine. And it's not all fine. You might make a friend, but you're still going to have this systemic injustice issue that hasn't been addressed.
Yeah. You know, how I have found the bereaved parents, just in the sheer honesty of sharing their stories and not pulling punches, not apologizing. Although it's not the same, but it reminds me of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, where before any reconciliation can take place at all, an honest sharing of stories and maybe even an asking of forgiveness, but an honest sharing of personal stories, so it humanizes the other. That's a necessary first step, and that's what has impressed me about the bereaved parents group more than anything else. Let me ask you. You're finding still the presence of Christian Zionism in Jerusalem. What's the impact of Christian Zionism in the Holy Land these days? Is it growing? Has it plateaued? I mean, what's your experience of Christian Zionist movements there?
I don't know if I could say whether it's growing or not. It's definitely still a huge movement, you know, a huge ideology here, and mostly coming from the outside. You know, it's really so many American Christians that come here with ideas that they need to support Israel so that Jesus will come back sooner. And you know, if you are familiar with Christian Zionism at all, you know that this is it's really dangerous to this place and to the people of this place, because it's not really, this ideology is not really seeing the people in this place today, but it's making Jerusalem fit in to this construct that people have, this theological construct. But you know, it's not, go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
It's not just outsiders. I mean, it is here. There, for example, the school that my children went to, the Anglican school, is actually very Zionist, Christian Zionist school at its core. The board is quite Christian Zionist, and so it's here. You know, it's definitely impacted here.
I guess that's what I was trying to get at too, because I remember about a year or two before Bishop Yunan retired, he was a longtime friend. And so we sat in his office and had a long conversation. And he talked to me about how more and more the indigenous Christian community there was being impacted. And even, he didn't use the word convert, but that there were more and more indigenous Palestinian Christians who were exhibiting these theological views.
There are some.
I guess I was wondering if you're finding that to be the case anymore.
Yeah, I mean, there's even there's a pastor in Bethlehem, a Palestinian pastor in Bethlehem who is very Christian Zionist. And so it's, yeah, it has infiltrated into the culture here. I don't have as much day-to-day contact with folks like that, you know, because typically these groups are not coming to Redeemer when they come to visit. But it definitely is impacting people.
Are there, here's another question, coming back to one of the things you talked about before. Are there Jewish protests against annexation happening? Where's the Jewish peace movement, the so-called Israeli left or Jewish left? Are there any Israeli protests against annexation?
There have been in the last few weeks, yeah, and in Tel Aviv and a little bit here in Jerusalem. So I've been really pleased to see that. It is very small, and most folks here will talk about the disappearing or already disappeared Israeli left. I mean, the government here has swung very right wing, and even the groups that are supposedly moderates are actually very, very right wing. Yeah. So that's just the shift all the way. But you know, the Israeli left is there. I just think they're so small now. It's hard for them to make an impact.
I just have a couple more questions for you, Carrie. Again, I appreciate your time. You're up late on a Thursday evening, and we appreciate your presence here. On the Feast of the Ascension a few weeks ago, you said the following: "We're not returning to life post-COVID-19 because there is no such thing. There's only life with COVID-19, at least for now." So catch us up with life with COVID-19 today on Thursday, and the reopening of businesses, institutions, holy sites. What's the status of Redeemer Church these days? Talk to us about life with COVID-19 in your world.
So we opened up for worship 3 weeks ago, and I want to say we were in a very different place than the United States at that time. We had we had new cases in the single digits every day in all of Israel. So, you know, we had 5 new cases a day, or for a couple of days, none at all. So at that time, things started to open. We do temperature checks at the door. Everyone's required to wear a mask, especially for singing. So they keep it on all the time.
Social distancing.
Social distancing, which is not a hard thing right now because I only have about 20 congregation members left in the country, because so many of my congregation members are international diplomats or workers, and they were called back to their home countries.
Are you getting any tourists at all? I mean,
no one is allowed in. No one's allowed into the country unless they are citizens or can prove that their center of life is here. And even then, if you come in from anywhere else, you have to be in quarantine for 2 weeks. So it's still very, very closed down. We have no tourists. Interestingly, we do have tourists in the old city, and they are Israelis from other parts of the country. So that's been interesting. You know, often if you talk to Israelis who live in the north, you know, live in Tel Aviv or other places, they'll say, "Oh, how can you live in Jerusalem?" They just think Jerusalem's weird and religious and conservative, which it kind of is. So they think, why would you go there? Some Israelis have only been here once in their lives, you know. But now they're coming because the tourists are gone, and it's kind of an interesting time. You can walk through the old city with no crowds whatsoever. And so, yeah, that's been interesting to see. Life with COVID, I'll tell you, so our church is open. Our church office is in operation. The other congregations, though, of the ELCJHL are really struggling financially because the economy of the West Bank is totally based on tourism. It's totally about tourism in Bethlehem and in these areas. So if you don't have tourists, people don't have jobs. And if people don't have jobs, then they're not paying the tuition for their kids to go to our schools, which means, and the schools are also the way that the church is sustainable and pays other employees. I mean, it's really just it's a dire situation, to the point that we are paying our teachers, but I think now after next month, they'll go down to 50% salary, even though they've been teaching online. They've continued to teach, as you know, and will continue. And we have families we've needed to help with real basic needs, with just buying groceries and keeping power on. So
Shops open at all? Shops open at all or anything?
Shops are open, yeah. Grocery stores are open. Restaurants have started to open with outdoor seating. Schools are in session. Schools went back about a month ago, but unfortunately now we've had a huge climb in the number of cases. So we're back up to about 180 to 200 new cases per day.
Yeah.
Whereas we were, as I said, we were down to 5 per day or fewer.
You know, there was a question early on that I wanted to make sure we got to, and that is, how can we support your ministry or the other ministries in Jerusalem?
So thank you for asking that. A couple of things. First of all, the way to support me to make sure that I get to stay here and do my work is through ELCA Global Mission. And there's actually a direct link where you can give in any amount to support my ministry. It's not like it goes into my pocket, by the way. It goes to Global Mission and funds to all the missionaries, but it's helpful if you put there that it came from, you click Carrie Ballenger, and then it helps. But if you want to help the church here, the Palestinian Lutheran churches here, and with what I just told you about, there's a group called Opportunity Palestine, which was formed initially. It's a 501c3 in the United States. It was formed to just help the schools and a way for Americans to easily be able to give to, and that was going towards scholarships for the Lutheran schools. Now, in the midst of this COVID crisis, anything that's given to Opportunity Palestine will go to the church, to ELCJHL, and go to the greatest need. And sometimes right now, the greatest need has been really buying food for the church families and making sure that they have basics. So that's really appreciated. If you know anybody that would like to help in that way, just try opportunitypalestine.org, I believe.
Okay, thank you. Give us a word about what you see as the role of the Christian church in the U.S. Regarding Israel and Palestine. Most of the people who are online here, I mean, I don't know everyone who's here, but most of the folks who I see here belong to Christian churches, Christian denominations. What do you see as the role of the Christian church to be as helpful as possible?
Well, I always appreciate knowing that people are praying for us here, you know, just including Palestinian Christians in your prayers. I think that's really helpful. Christians here will often say they feel forgotten by the West, and forgotten in conversations about Israel and Palestine, because people will talk about Palestinians and I think that the image that comes to people's mind is a Muslim, and they forget that there are actually Christians here. I think the other way to be helpful is to combat things like Christian Zionism when you encounter them in your theology or among your church members, and especially combating these dehumanizing stories that you might hear when people will say, well, you know, all the Muslims, all Palestinians just want to push Israel into the sea, or when you hear things like that you know not to be true, especially those of you who have been here and have seen it, to really just speak up and say, you know, that is not that's not my experience. That's not who I met. That's not, you know, there are Christians and Muslims and Jews here who want peace and want justice and want reconciliation. I think that's just important to combat it, just as we step up when we hear a racist joke. It's not a joke, right? You stand up and you say something. I would love to see Christians in America doing the same thing about Israel and Palestine, and really, and the same goes for anti-Semitism. I mean, we have plenty of that going through the church as well. It shows up in our sermons often.
Last question.
Mm.
You kind of touched on it earlier, but I thought I'd give you a chance to maybe kind of expand upon your answer. We're in an election year here in the U.S. Donald Trump has been a disaster for the Palestinian cause, but Joe Biden's political history is one of unconditional support for the state of Israel. So as someone who ministers to those who deal with the impact, the brunt in many ways of U.S. unconditional support for Israel, give us a pastoral word about our role as citizens in the next few months.
Well, I think it's good that you point out that the Democratic candidate for president also doesn't have a great record on Israel-Palestine. I think that's good. And to be fair, people here are not too excited about Barack Obama either, because he didn't go far enough or do. So, I mean, we can't pretend that if you just vote Democrat, everything's going to be fine. I think our role right now is to push. It seems that Biden is going to be the candidate, right? So to push his campaign and his team to go further and to really push him to pay attention to the cause here. But I don't know that there's much you can do except to do that, to lobby, to get out and vote, make sure people vote. I wish I had a better pastoral word for you. I don't know. I mean, maybe we wait for my sermon on Sunday. I should have something to say about hope by then. And then you
hope in the midst of suffering. It wasn't just any old hope, it was hope in the midst of suffering, Carrie.
Yeah, right.
Thanks. I'm gonna give Carrie the last word, but before I do, Indiana Center for Middle East Peace is supporting the Poor People's Campaign virtual march on Washington, D.C. on Saturday morning, June the 20th. So we're really a part of that. I'm part of the Prophetic Council. A number of our folks are very involved with the Poor People's Campaign. So check out the Poor People's Campaign website for the Zoom link. Originally, as you know, the Poor People's Campaign was going to converge tens and tens and tens of thousands of people on the nation's capital on June the 20th. With the pandemic quarantine now, we're doing a virtual march on Washington. So check out the Zoom link for the Poor People's Campaign virtual website for Saturday morning, June the 20th. We'll also be continuing our series of interviews with other peacemakers in the coming weeks, and we'll be making those interview times and dates available to those on our activist network, and we'll let you know. So Pastor Carrie Ballenger, it's just a delight to spend time with you, Carrie. Thanks for coming today. Any parting words for us?
Thanks for asking me, and thanks for all that you're doing. And I think it's just wonderful. I looked at the lineup of speakers and people you've been hearing from, and what a wonderful organization you have, and offering this to people online is it's an unexpected blessing of this time, isn't it? This opportunity to connect across boundaries even further. And I think the last thing I want to say is, you know, Jerusalem is known as the Holy City, but my experience has been that what I've learned the most is that every city is holy, every place is holy. And this place is no more holy than Indiana, Oklahoma. I see Karen Fowler-Lindemulder over there, so I know Oklahoma is on the line. I just think we need to remember that God is with us everywhere, in every place, in every time. And thank God for that.
Well, Carrie, thank you. You know, one of the blessings for me, I know some of these people who have been on these interviews with us personally, and some very well. Others, I just recognize their names. But the people who've been on these interviews, as I look around and see their names, these folks are making huge differences in terms of the cause for justice, not only for the Palestinian struggle for justice, but also in their own communities here at home. And it's been a blessing for me to connect with them, even though I just know them by their names through these interviews. So Carrie, thanks. If you could hang on just for a minute after the interview, I won't keep you long. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Don't forget to join the Poor People's Campaign virtual march on DC on Saturday, June the 20th. Thanks for joining us today. Goodbye, everyone.